Amazon rainforest is an ocean of trees. If you fall in there, you'll never be found. On September 3rd, 1989, Varig Flight 254 took off from Maraba, headed to Belém. It was supposed to be a short, 45-minute flight. But due to a simple navigational error, the aircraft entered a path of no return. The passengers didn't know it, but the plane wasn't heading north. It was going straight into the heart of the Amazon rainforest. The fuel ran out. The plane crashed, but that wasn't the end. The survivors woke up in the middle of the jungle, surrounded by trees so tall they blocked out the sunlight. The silence was absolute. No sound of rescue, no animal noises, nothing. They were alive, but they weren't alone. The black box recorded the pilot's last words before impact. But what came after has never been explained. Now tell me, what would you do if you realized the forest was watching you? The scorching heat of Maraba reflected off the white fuselage of the Varig Boeing 737-200. Inside the cockpit, the pilots adjusted the instruments, checking the final details before takeoff. The first officer, anxious, scanned the flight plan. 27.0 degrees. It was his first major route as a first officer, and he didn't want to make a mistake. The experienced captain entered the route into the navigation system, but a detail went unnoticed. Instead of 27.0 degrees, he entered 270 degrees. The difference seemed small, but it changed everything. They were pointed west, not north. Their fate had been sealed. The control tower authorized takeoff. The engines roared, and the plane gained speed on the runway. The passengers were settled in, carefree. The cabin vibrated with the power of the engines, and one by one, the seats reclined. In seconds, the aircraft left the ground. The flight had begun. The city of Maraba was left behind, quickly disappearing. Whitish clouds spread across the sky, while below, the immensity of the Amazon rainforest stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a beautiful yet overwhelming scene, a jungle that seemed infinite. The first officer adjusted the panel controls, checking the altitude and flight stability. Everything seemed perfect. He looked at the captain, who simply smiled and said, "Just another smooth flight." The young officer relaxed, unaware that the tranquility was just an illusion. The passengers laughed, talked, and read magazines. Some dozed off under the gentle rocking of the plane. The beverage cart passed through the aisle, and a flight attendant served coffee to a couple in the front row. For everyone there, it was just another flight. But then, something subtle began to bother the captain. Time was passing. He looked at the panel, checking their position. Based on the flight time, Belém should already be visible. But when he looked out the window, there was no city, just the same endless green carpet. He frowned. He turned the radio knob, trying to pick up the signal from the Belém tower. No response. The first officer noticed the captain's confused expression and asked, "Is everything all right?" The captain hesitated. Doubt began to grow. The silence in the cockpit was broken by a single noise, a slight crackle on the radio frequency, like an incomprehensible whisper lost in the static. Interference, a warning, or just meaningless noise? Outside, the forest continued to swallow the horizon. And inside the cabin, the first officer didn't know that this was the last time he would see the sky without fear. The aircraft's panel flickered as if it were in total failure. The constant noise of alarms mixed with the hiss of the radio. The first officer felt his hands sweat on the controls. The Boeing was no longer flying. It was gliding helplessly. The captain kept his voice steady, but he knew it was the end. The radio was open, communication with the tower still active. But the response that came wasn't a rescue alert. Garces, "Why couldn't you get to Belém?" The question came from a pilot on the ground. A chance to explain. The captain took a deep breath and replied, trying to remain calm, "No, it's just that I didn't have the indication for Belém." The compass was on a different heading and we kept going between Balem and Maraba and couldn't get anywhere. Now we're going to Maraba and we don't have any more fuel to go anywhere. Understand? The radio went silent. No response. And then engine 1 stopped. The descent truly began. The Boeing tilted to the left, losing lift. The first officer felt his stomach rise, as if he were on an out-of-control roller coaster. The captain picked up the cabin microphone and, in a low, firm voice, spoke the last phrase recorded by the black box. Engine 1 has just stopped. We're gonna have to go down now. I won't be able to say that we're going to prepare for landing. Okay? Attention crew, prepare for a forced landing. In the passenger cabin, panic set in. The sound of oxygen masks dropping was followed by desperate screams and prayers. Some people cried, others clung to their seats. But in the midst of the chaos, a different sound emerged on the radio. The first officer froze upon hearing it. The radio, which should have been transmitting communication with the tower, repeated the captain's last phrase. Engine 1 has just stopped. We're going to have to go down now. The voice was identical, but something was wrong. The tone was slightly distorted, like an echo coming from a place that shouldn't exist. The first officer looked at the captain, expecting some reaction. But the captain was pale. He had heard it too. The cabin shook violently. The trees were now too close. The Boeing tore through the cloud layer, heading straight for an inevitable destination. On the radio, the voice spoke again. We're going to have to go down now. But this time, it wasn't just an echo. It was someone or something responding. And then the first officer closed his eyes and waited for the impact. The impact was a clash of iron and flesh against the earth. The Boeing tore through the forest like a blade, ripping trees in its path. The wings were immediately severed, the engines swallowed by the vegetation. The nose of the plane almost crashed head-on into a severed trunk, by a matter of meters. Then silence. The captain opened his eyes and tasted blood in his mouth. He blinked, his mind still cloudy, and tried to move. The seatbelt cut into his chest. The smell of burning fuel and twisted metal permeated the air. The cabin was destroyed. He turned his head to the side, looking for the first officer. But he was no longer moving. The captain closed his eyes, holding back the despair in his chest. The young man who had flown alongside him for hours was now dead, and he was the only crew member alive. In the aisle of the aircraft, cries of pain and calls for help echoed. Survivors tried to free themselves from the wreckage. Limbs were broken, wounds were open. But amidst the chaos, a detail began to bother the captain. Where were the sounds of the forest? No birds, no animals, not even the wind. It was as if something had silenced the jungle, as if the forest was waiting for something. That's when he heard the first strange noise. The plane's beacon, the emergency tracker, was trying to send distress signals, but the location indicated was impossible. The Brazilian Air Force received the coordinates and refused to believe it. The Boeing wasn't in Para. The Boeing wasn't in northern Brazil. The coordinates pointed to a region in Mato Grosso, São Felix do Xingu. That didn't make sense. The captain felt a chill run down his spine. If they were really in Mato Grosso, how the hell had they flown so far without realizing it? The survivors began to despair. The beacon needed water to send a stronger signal. With no alternative, they filled a bucket with urine and submerged the tracker in it. The sound of the signal became stronger. But that's when the woodsman, a passenger named Antonio Saraiva, realized something even worse. He climbed a nearby tree, looked around, and froze. There was no smoke on the horizon, no sign of civilization, no helicopters, no trails. They were alone. But the instant he climbed down from the tree, a crackle came from the woods. A strange noise, far away, deep, as if something big was moving among the trees. Something that was only now beginning to realize they were there. The heat was suffocating, the air thick and heavy with humidity and the smell of wet earth. The captain felt his mind throbbing, trying to concentrate. The survivors needed help. But before that, they needed to get out of there alive. The woodsman, Antonio, approached, his expression tense. "There's a stream nearby," he said, pointing to a trail among the trees. "But this forest is strange. It's wrong." The captain raised his eyebrows. "Wrong how?" Antonio didn't answer immediately. He scratched his chin, looking around, as if searching for something. "It's too silent." The other survivors had also noticed. No animal noises, no insects. The jungle was a well of absolute silence. The captain tried to ignore the chill in his spine. They had more urgent things to deal with, but the forest seemed to breathe. The survivors began to organize themselves. The less injured helped the more debilitated. The bucket with urine finally activated the beacon, and a signal was sent. But now all they could do was wait. Antonio decided to venture into the woods, looking for more water. The captain felt uneasy, but he couldn't stop him. They needed to survive. As the woodsman disappeared among the branches, the first strange noise echoed in the woods. A dry crackle, like something big moving. The captain held his breath. The other passengers heard it too. Then the crackle came again. Closer. Antonio returned hurriedly, his face sweaty. "There are footprints near the stream." The captain gasped. "Footprints?" Antonio nodded, his eyes dark. Big, deep, and fresh. Silence weighed between them. They weren't alone, and whoever or whatever was watching them knew exactly where they were. The tension was unbearable. Every leaf moved as if it were hiding something behind it. The captain looked around, expecting to see something emerge from the woods, but nothing came. Then the most awaited sound of all arrived. Engines, helicopters. The survivors ran to the middle of the clearing, waving frantically. The woodsman raised his arms, pointing to the sky. The Brazilian Air Force had finally found them. The captain felt immediate relief, but his instinct still screamed. Something didn't seem right. The helicopters flew low, and the soldiers celebrated upon seeing them. They were safe, or at least they should be. When the first soldiers descended by ropes, a strong breeze blew from the woods. A strange smell came with it. It was a damp, dense odor, like overturned earth and something else. The captain craned his neck, looking at the edge of the forest. For a second, he was sure he saw something among the trees. A tall shadow, immobile, watching, but when he blinked, there was nothing there. The survivors began to be hoisted into the helicopters. Wounded first, then the others. But Antonio didn't move. The woodsman stood still, staring fixedly at the forest, as if he were listening to something. The captain approached him. "Are you all right? Let's get out of here." Antonio turned slowly. His eyes seemed distant. He hesitated for a moment, then replied, "We shouldn't have called them." The captain didn't have time to ask what he meant. The helicopter lifted off the ground, taking the last survivors. But as they ascended, he looked at the woods one last time, and he saw the branches moving, as if something was retreating into the shadows, something that didn't want to be seen, but that had been there all along. And then the radio crackled. A familiar voice emerged on the frequency. "Engine 1 has just stopped. We're going to have to go down now." It was the captain's voice, but he hadn't said anything, and the plane had already crashed 2 days ago. The captain never boarded a plane again. Even after the accident, the testimonies, and the investigations, he could never explain what happened that night. The authorities concluded that the error in the route was the cause of the accident, but no one ever explained how the plane ended up so far off the original route, or why the beacon sent impossible coordinates, or still, why the radios continued to pick up impossible messages days after the accident. Some witnesses say that on the night following the rescue, One of the Brazilian Air Force helicopters passed through the crash site to photograph the wreckage, and the soldiers reported something strange. The wreckage was there, exactly where the survivors had said, but there were no human footprints in the area. It was as if no one had been there, but the black box recording was real. And even today, if you listen to the final transmission of Flight 254, the captain's last warning echoes in the static of the radio. Engine 1 has just stopped. We're going to have to go down now. Only no one has ever been able to explain why. Sometimes, on silent early mornings, this transmission still appears on some radio frequencies, as if the flight was still happening, or as if someone inside was still trying to get to Belém. Varig Flight 254 never reached its destination. The survivors were rescued, but the plane remained in the jungle forever. To this day, the wreckage of the Boeing 737-200 is there, in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. But the metal structure has not been forgotten. Over the years, relic hunters, explorers, and looters have ventured into the woods to remove everything that was left. Today, the plane is empty, but those who dared to take something from there report disturbing things. A lost watch, a golden ring, a farewell gift from someone who never returned home. Objects that do not belong to the world of the living. And there is one account in particular of a man who stole something from the first officer. And since then, he has never slept peacefully again. If you want to hear the real recording of the cockpit of Flight 254, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay until the end. Because some flights never come to an end. Some are trapped in time, and decades later, the wreckage of Varig Flight 254 is still there, in the heart of the Amazon. But what if I told you that not everything was left behind? In the years following the accident, explorers and looters ventured into the jungle, stealing everything that remained. But some took more than just objects. They took something that should never have been removed. And those who touched these relics were never the same again. This is the story of a man who entered the wreckage of Flight 254 seeking wealth. But he left with something that didn't belong to the world of the living. And by the time he realized it, it was too late. The silence of the forest was suffocating. Carlos adjusted his backpack and pushed through the dense undergrowth. He had walked this path before, but something about tonight felt different. The plane was still there. Decades later, Varig Flight 254 remained a metallic tomb in the middle of the Amazon. The crumpled fuselage, the empty windows, a place time forgot. Carlos never believed in ghost stories, but he had heard rumors. People who ventured into the wreckage and came back different. Some said they heard voices. Others disappeared into the forest. He didn't care about that. His goal was simple: grab what he could and sell it on the black market. He climbed the side of the Boeing, his fingers touching the cold metal. Inside, the plane was hollow, devoured by time. In the narrow aisle, rows of empty seats stared at him like dead eyes. The floor was covered in leaves, as if the forest was trying to swallow what remained. That's when he saw the door to the cockpit, and something inside him told him not to go in. But he went in anyway. Carlos entered the cockpit, trying to ignore the sudden chill that filled the space. The buttons and levers were covered in dust, some still tilted in the last position left by the pilots. He ran his fingers across the panel, observing the dead instruments, as if they were waiting for a final command. That's when something glinted in the dark. In the corner, on top of what remained of the first officer's seat, was a golden pocket watch, covered by a thin layer of dust. Carlos approached. The chain looked new, untouched by time. He picked up the watch and opened the cover. Inside, there was an inscription engraved, "Forever with you." Hey, Carlos frowned. The watch was stopped at the exact time of the accident. 9:06 p.m. He felt a shiver run down his spine. That's when he heard a crack behind him. He turned quickly, but no one was in the cockpit. Carlos tried to ignore the growing discomfort. He stuffed the watch in his pocket and hurried out of the cockpit. His footsteps echoed through the empty aisle. But as he left the wreckage, he felt a strange weight on his shoulders, as if someone was walking right behind him. He didn't look back, and maybe he should have. Carlos arrived home late that night. Slumped on the sofa, he took the watch out of his pocket and observed it under the dim light of the room. The gold shone in a strange way. The chain was cold, as if it had just come out of the water. He opened the cover. 9:06 p.m. The hand didn't move. Carlos frowned. He gave the mechanism a light tap. Nothing. He put the watch on the table and went to take a shower. The hot water ran down his face, but the discomfort remained. There was something wrong in that house. When he came out of the bathroom, the watch was on the floor. The chain stretched out, as if it had been pulled. He took a deep breath and picked up the object again. The glass of the watch was now foggy. Carlos wiped it with his fingers and froze. The reflection wasn't his. For a moment, he saw something else there. A man, in a pilot's uniform. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, as if he was coming from a place where no one survives. Carlos threw the watch away, his heart racing. The object hit the wall, but the sound was muffled, as if the watch had no weight at all. The silence of the house seemed greater now. Carlos looked at the floor. The watch had returned to the same place where it was before, and when he opened the cover again, the hand had moved. 9:07 p.m. For the first time in decades, Carlos couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard something. A metallic sound, soft, rhythmic, the ticking of the watch. But he had thrown the watch away. He got up in the middle of the night, sweating cold. The room was dark, but he felt a presence there. The air was dense, heavy, as if someone was breathing next to him. Carlos turned on the light, and the watch was back on the bedside table. Open. The hands now read 9:06 p.m. Again, he grabbed the object angrily, crossed the house and threw it in the trash. He turned to leave, but something passed through the corner of his vision. The mirror. There he was, the first officer, standing in the doorway, pale, motionless. His eyes were sunken and empty, as if they no longer belonged to this world. And then the spirit's mouth opened. But the sound that came out wasn't a voice. It was the radio from an airplane cockpit. "Engine 1 just quit. We're going to have to go down now." Carlos ran to the bathroom, closed the door and huddled in the corner. The sound of the watch continued, and when he looked at the floor, the watch was there, open. 9:06 p.m. Again, he realized that he should never have taken that object. But now, it was too late. Carlos couldn't stay in that house anymore. The watch always came back to him. The spirit didn't speak, but it was always there. At the door, in the mirror, in the window. He drove aimlessly, his hands shaking on the wheel. The watch was on the passenger seat. He swore he had thrown it away, but there it was, open. 9:06 p.m. Carlos picked up the watch and threw it out the window. The object rolled into the middle of the road. He accelerated, leaving the scene behind. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his heart. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, his soul froze. The first officer was sitting in the back seat. Carlos screamed and lost control of the car. The vehicle left the road and overturned. Everything went dark. When he opened his eyes, he was in the middle of the forest. The car was destroyed, but the watch was next to him, open. 9:06 p.m. Then, a voice echoed in the woods. The voice of the first officer. "You took what is not yours." Carlos tried to run, but the watch burned in his hand. He couldn't let go. And then, everything around him disappeared. He was no longer in the forest. He was in the plane's cockpit, and the plane was falling. The impact was instantaneous. Carlos felt no pain, just a dense silence, as if time had stopped. He opened his eyes, and he was in the cockpit of Flight 254. The panel flickered weakly, the buttons worn, the glass shattered. But he wasn't alone. The first officer was in the seat, looking at him. The voice came out low, hoarse. "This watch was never yours." Carlos tried to answer, but his throat no longer worked. The cabin shook. Through the front window, he saw what was happening. The plane was falling. But this wasn't a flashback. He was inside the fall. The Earth was approaching. The sound of the engine was a muffled scream. And then, everything went dark. Days later, a group of adventurers explored the region where the wreckage of Flight 254 lay. The metal taken over by rust, the seats swallowed by the jungle. One of the men moved away from the group, walking among the dry leaves. Something gleamed on the ground. He crouched down, picking up the object. It was a golden pocket watch, the chain perfectly intact. He opened the cover. The hands read 9:06 p.m. And then, something moved inside the plane. The clock never stopped. Still out there, waiting to be found again. And whoever dares to take it might end up like Carlos. Many stories are forgotten with time, but some insist on returning. What else lurks in the shadows of Brazil? Horror stories aren't just fiction. In the most isolated places, in small towns, in the forests and deserted roads, something waits for those who don't believe. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe and listen now to the real cockpit audio of Flight 247. Remembering that I am not responsible if this transmission stays with you forever, because Brazil hides secrets that few know, and some should never be discovered.
Tivemos uma pane de desorientação de nosso sistema de bússola. Estamos com nosso combustível já no final, ainda com 15 minutos. A todos que mantenham a calma, porque uma situação como essa realmente foi difícil de acontecer. Estamos a todos com a esperança de que isso não passe de apenas um susto para todos nós. Muito obrigado e todos Você nunca pediu para Belém por quê? Não, porque não tinha indicação de Belém, a bússola estava com outra proa, a gente ficou andando entre Belém e Marabá e não conseguiu chegar a lugar nenhum. Agora está indo para Marabá e não tem mais combustível para ir para lugar nenhum, entendeu? Um acabou de parar, a gente vai ter que descer agora. Não vou poder falar mais, que a gente vai se preparar aqui para o pouso, ok? Atenção, tripulação, preparada para o pouso passado.